Okay, so you should have your notes to go along with this video. At the top, I just wanted you guys to jot down a couple things just to remember and to reference a couple things we've got to keep in mind when we're looking at inverse functions. The first, for the inverse function, our function's written as f of x. Remember, our inverse function is written as f with that little -1 to the x. So remember, every time you see this, it's referencing the inverse function, okay? The next thing, remember, you interchange or you flip-flop the independent, so the x, and the dependent, the y. So we're just interchanging, we switch, we flip-flop the x and the y variables to find the inverse. That last thing I want you guys to keep in mind, f of x and then the inverse of f of x are reflective. They are reflective, so they reflect over y equals x, okay? So f of x, our function, the inverse of that function reflect each other over y equals x, and we'll see that in just a little bit, okay? So what I want you guys to do for now, I've given you a function. I've given you a quadratic function. That's the first function type that we're going to look at with inverses is quadratic. We'll move on to a couple more once we've gotten this one down. So for quadratic, I've given you your function. F of x is equal to x minus 1 squared, because it's quadratic, minus 6. I want you guys to graph this function on your calculator. So go ahead and graph your parenthesis x minus 1 squared minus 6. And once you've got that graph up, pull up a table of values. Record those values in your table down here that's labeled f of x. It's on your paper. So graph this. You've got a table to put some points on. You've also got a graph. So once you get those tables, go ahead and sketch a quick graph of that. It doesn't have to be perfect, but we just want just a rough visualization of what this function looks like. So go ahead and pause this video, graph this, fill in your table of values, get that graph sketched over here on this graph. So go ahead and do that. Just pause the video. Okay, so hopefully you have got that table of values and you've got that graph sketched. I don't, but you guys might need that. You guys will need that later on, and there'll be another video posted with those as well. But for now, what I want to do is focus on getting that inverse. Okay, so it's easy to graph this function and to get our table of values, but we can't get our inverse function yet. We can't do that yet because we don't know what it is. Okay, so it's very similar to the linear equation one. Like I mentioned earlier, f of x is the same thing as y. So we've got y is equal to x minus 1 squared minus 6. Same thing, very same thing. I just switched the f of x and the y because remember, to find the inverse, we just flip-flop the x and the y. So instead of y, I'm going to have an x. Instead of x, I'm going to have a y. So I'll have y minus 1 in parentheses squared minus 6. My first step is to just flip-flop the x and the y. Now I've got to solve for y. Remember, you cannot graph an x equals. You have to have the y by itself. Okay? First thing I'm going to do is move this 6 over. This is a minus 6, so to move it over, I'm going to add it. Okay? So plus 6 to both sides. Cancels it out over there. That's what I want to do. I wanted to get rid of it. So on this side, I've now got x plus 6 equal to my y minus 1 squared. Okay? To get rid of a square, the opposite of squaring something is to find this square root. So I need to get rid of this squared. So I'm going to do the square root of y minus 1 squared, which means I have to do the square root of x plus 6. The square root of y minus 1 squared is just y minus 1. So now I've just got a y minus 1 over there. On this side, I've got the square root of x plus 6. It's that easy. You don't need to do anything to it. Just drop it on down. I've almost got the y by itself. I just need to move this 1 over. It's being subtracted. So easy, easy fix. I'm just going to add it. It's now gone. I have the y by itself, finally. That's my goal. On this side, I've got this square root of x plus 6. And then I've got plus 1. Okay? Now notice this plus 1 is not under that square root. It's being added to the square root of x plus 6. So just be careful when you write that. Make sure it's not under the square root or it's going to be a different function. Okay? Now one thing that I do want to go back to, okay? When you take the square root of this side and you take the square root of this side, notice, so I've just got the square root of x plus 6. What I should have is plus or minus the square root of x plus 6. Okay? This is a super common mistake, so just be careful. Remember, whenever you take the square root of something, it's plus or minus. Okay? So I have my inverse function now. Okay? So my inverse function is just plus or minus the square root of x plus 6 plus 1. That's it. Okay? So so I've got my y, the inverse function, so I know inverse function, remember that's how we write it, is equal to plus or minus the square root of x plus 6 with our plus 1. We're done. We found our inverse function. Okay? That's about all that I want you guys to be able to do at this point in time. We'll continue this later on. What I do want to do, though, is show you why we have to have a plus or a minus square root. I think if you understand why, then it might help you remember later on down the road. Okay? So just right here, you don't need to write this down. You can just watch. If you take 3 times 3, you get 9. Okay? You can also do negative 3 times negative 3, and you still get a positive 9. So the square root of 9, it has 2. You can multiply a positive 3 times a positive 3 and get 9, or a negative 3 and a negative 3. So there are 2 answers, okay? It's either 3 squared or negative 3 squared. That's why we've got a plus and a minus for the square root. You might forget it the first few times. You'll get the hang of it.